I'm Peter Reinhardt, and this episode is brought to you by my friends at Forno Bravo. Craft the best tasting bread. And in the baking business, you want yours to be the best, or so you have customers. So whoever develops and delivers the most flavor to the customer wins, usually. So that's the craft, is evoking the full potential of flavor trapped in the grain. And you do that by following the time-honored traditions of the stages of transforming the basic ingredient, wheat, which is turned into flour, into bread. So I call it the journey from wheat to eat. And I have broken it down into a 12-stage journey. So the first stage of the wheat to eat journey, the journey of wheat becoming bread, is that it's growing in the field. It's a grass, and it's all around. And the grass puts out seeds, and we harvest the seeds, and we cut down the grass. Well, the grass can grow back or not, but the seeds is what becomes flour. So those seeds still have life in them. But when we cut down that wheat and we harvest the seeds, we're gathering the life force of that wheat and collecting it. And then we take it to a mill. And the first transformation that takes place in that wheat is grinding the wheat into flour, at which point we destroy the life-giving properties of the wheat. It's no longer alive anymore, or no longer has the potential to create more wheatgrass. It can't grow anymore. It's flour. That's what a miller does. And then there's a whole craft and art of milling. The baker then takes this raw ingredient, flour, which is lifeless, and forms it together, turns it into a kind of a clay by adding water, salt, and some kind of leavening, whether it's yeast or sourdough starter, but we call it leaven. And the word leaven means to enliven, to bring to life. And that leaven, usually in the form of yeast, brings this lifeless lump of clay made from the water and the salt and the flour to life, because the yeast injects living biological organisms into this lump of clay. So suddenly we have a lump of clay brought to life. And it already you start to get this sort of metaphorical connection between wheat and why it shows up in scriptures and, in spiritual literature as, the Adam story is Adam and Eve were from a, lump of clay. In fact, the word Adam means clay. The origin of the word Adam, it's clay. So essentially humans in the Bible story were brought to life by injecting clay with the breath of life. So bread is sort of this little parallel story. We're not talking about now creating an atom or a living, intelligent life form, but we have a living form. And we know it's alive because after we mix this dough, we're calling it dough now instead of clay, and we all mix it, it grows. It starts to wake up and it grows. So the first stage of bread making is what we call mise-en-place, the gathering of the ingredients and getting organized and putting it all together. And the second stage is mixing. And so I'm going to break this down into the 12 stages just to take you through this journey. This is a parallel journey to our life. And this is why I think bread is so intrinsic to our being. So we take this clay, bring it to life by injecting it with leaven. We mix the dough in stage 2 of the 12. Where the goal is to mix the dough to evenly distribute the ingredients, to develop the gluten, and to activate the leaven, the yeast, which we do as soon as we add water to the leaven, it wakes up. So now this lump of clay comes to life and becomes a living dough. In stage 3, we call that fermentation. Fermentation is when yeast and bacteria eat sugars, digest them, and create as a byproduct acid, carbon dioxide, and alcohol. And all those things have flavor in them. What they're doing is they're digesting the natural sugars that are in the dough and creating alcohol, which gives flavor to the dough, acids, which give take the flavor profile into a more acidic range that our taste buds respond and like, and carbon dioxide, which allows the dough to rise and grow and trap the carbon dioxide to create an airy bread. All that's going on. So now suddenly we see this organism brought back to life in fermentation. And over the next few stages of the process, it continues to ferment, but we then do distinctive things to the living dough. After the first fermentation, we call the bulk fermentation, we divide that dough into smaller units. whether it's a loaf or rolls or pizza doughs. We divide it, and then we shape it. We do a pre-shape. So that's the next thing. The dividing is 4. 5 is pre-shaping it into either a round or a little oblong or whatever the pre-shape is going to be. And then we let it rest. Now that resting could be anywhere from 5 or 10 minutes for the gluten to relax. It could be 20 minutes, or it could just be immediately after we go into the next phase, which is after resting is final shaping. We give it the shape that it's going to have before it gets baked. And that could be a baguette. It can be a loaf of bread. It could be a pizza dough. Any of those things, final shape. From there, it goes into a stage we call panning, putting it on either a pan or in a linen cloth or something where it can go to the next stage. Resting is very quick. It happens. You get all the doughs in a resting mode, and then we go into and you pan it. So it's resting in a panned form, whether it's the final pan you bake it in or not. We call it panning, and then it goes into after we pan it, we go into a final fermentation. So we've worked our way up from shaping to panning to now final fermentation, which we call proofing. Now we're already up to stage 9. And final proofing is the dough rises to the shape and size it's supposed to be, trapping the carbon dioxide, creating flavor all this time. It's growing, and then we take it to stage 10, where the next level of transformation takes place. So we've gone through 2 transformations already. The first transformation was living wheat destroyed, the life force destroyed, so it goes from alive to dead. That's a radical change. So transformation means a radical change from one thing into something else. So the first radical change is alive to dead. The second radical change, which happens in stage 2 and 3, is dead brought back to life. I'd say that's pretty radical. And so stage transformation number 2 is dead brought back to life. Now we have what we call dough, living dough. The next transformation takes place in stage 10. Stage 10 is baking. And what baking is the application of heat to a product in an enclosed environment for the purpose of driving off moisture. That's the definition of baking. While we're applying heat to this product, moisture is being evaporated out because heat's driving off moisture. And that allows 3 transformations to take place, literal transformations at the literal level of the product itself, not poetic, not metaphorical, not, symbolic. Transformations are the sugars in this dough caramelize on the surface because the heat at above 350 degrees, sugars will brown. We call that browning caramelization. Proteins also have their own caramelization. We call it the Maillard reaction. That's what creates the crust. But the only place on bread that can get that hot, which is above 350 degrees, is the surface, because the surface is shielding and protecting the inside of the dough. So the surface can caramelize. Inside, as the temperature of the dough rises and it gets above 160 degrees, proteins coagulate. And coagulation is where the proteins denature, they unfold, they unravel from being tight coils to becoming these little threads and strands like soldiers lining up to create a matrix. And that matrix is what we think of when we eat the bread of those, that structure, the little cell structures of air pockets. So that's the protein. The protein, which is gluten in bread, that traps the carbon dioxide, and that is called coagulation. The third transformation that happens, and it happens at above 180 degrees Fahrenheit, is gelatinization. The gelatinization of starches. And what that means is they thicken. As starches get hotter and hotter and hotter, they suck up the moisture around them, and at a certain point they burst. They explode, and they suck up all the moisture that's surrounding them. They suck it up and thicken. And to liken that to like making a gravy. And as you add flour and broth and you stir it, and when it gets close to the boiling point, what happens? It thickens. That's gelatinization of starches. Well, those 3 chemical transformations are changing that dough into something that tastes totally different than what it went in. But also what's happening is, as soon as the dough crosses the temperature threshold of 136 to 138 degrees, the yeast, the leaven that was in there, whose mission was to raise the dough so that it could become bread, it can't live at above 140 degrees. In other words, the yeast has to give up its life. It sacrifices its life as it completes its mission. In order to complete its mission, it has to give up its life. because it dies. And so now we have alive to dead, because as the dough goes above these thresholds, the living part of the dough is killed. The starches, proteins, and sugars are all being transformed into something else. And so suddenly, instead of dough, you have a new product called bread. So the best way that I can get my students to kind of understand this is I say, it goes in alive, it comes out dead, but it goes in as dough and comes out as bread. And that happens at stage 10. Stage 11 of the 12-stage journey is that the bread then, when it comes out of the oven, has to cool. And while it's cooling, it's continuing to evaporate moisture, which is the definition of baking. It's so that we're getting towards the final product. The proteins, which have coagulated, are still very tender. The starches are thickening, but they still have some moisture still in them. So if you cut a hot bread too soon, it could still taste doughy to you, even though it's fully baked. So you let it cool. For a thin dough like a pizza dough, it could be just a couple minutes. For a focaccia, 5-7 minutes is all it takes to cool enough for the proteins to kind of settle in and create that structure. For a loaf of bread, a thick loaf of bread, it could take 90 minutes or so to really let it cool enough to where the dough is fully baked. But that's stage 11. So we call that cooling. It's really kind of like after baking. And then stage 12, which in the textbooks say, to package it, to store, to ship it, to do whatever. But in the process, in the bread baking process in my class, we call stage 12 eating. So the goal from my students is always to get to stage 12. But in order to get to stage 12, you have to go through the 11 stages that preceded. So we call that the journey from wheat to eat. And all those stages, when you step back and look at what's going on in those stages, work on so many different levels. The literal level of bread, the poetic or metaphorical level of symbolism of what bread means in scriptures and in cultural references. There's a third level of bread which is philosophical. It could be ethical, and I can bread as sometimes it's called money itself is sometimes called bread. It has all different implications at the philosophical level, and then at the deepest level of understanding. And all this goes back to the ancient teachings of people like Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas and all that. The deepest level is what we call the mystical level. And that's the level you really can't talk about. It's the level that taps into our soul and into our spirit. But bread, because all this is happening, whether you think about it or not, whether you have ever heard me talk about this or not, when you partake and when you participate in eating bread, you're participating in all four of those levels. And to some extent, there's a transparency between the literal level, that's the big open window, into the deeper levels. In fact, you can't get to the deeper levels without going through the literal level of bread itself. And since everybody eats bread pretty much, it is a window into these deeper parts of our being. That, in a nutshell, is why I think bread has such a special place in our hearts. And other fermented foods, such as cheeses, beers, wines, spirit beverages. There's a lot of things. Anything that's fermented that went through a living biological process at the literal level has been transformed through these actions, these biological actions, or through the chemical actions of the application of heat to change them. So they've been changed in many ways. So all foods are transformational and changed, but bread is one of the few that I can think of that works on all three levels of alive to dead brought back to life, and then alive, killed, but turned into something that tastes delicious and nourishes us and has our, what we call the staff of life. So that's why I think bread is so meaningful to people. I'm Peter Reinhardt, and I'll leave you with the baker's blessing. May your crust be crisp and your bread always rise. Hey folks, I'm Peter Reinhardt. This is my latest book, Pizza Quest. Check it out at your favorite bookseller. And until then, may your pizzas all be perfect.